Hello poker friends, Navinad here with yet another absolutely amazing poker strategy video. As you probably know, most of my videos are on the topic of heads up, no limit hold'em. Many of my videos, however, and I think probably the ones that get the most love and attention, or positive attention, are conceptual videos that relate to no limit hold'em strategy beyond just heads up, sit and goes. The subject of today's video is neither no limit hold'em, no limit hold'em heads up, sit and goes. No limit hold'em full ring. It's not six max. It's not even live cash games or all of the above. Today we're going to get real specific, and we're going to be talking about just one hand. We're going to be talking about ace king, and specifically we're going to talk about playing ace king before the flop. If you've ever coached anyone at no limit hold'em or even discussed poker with a player with pretty limited experience, like a novice player, you've probably heard the question, or a question very close to this question: how should I play ace king? Oh, something akin to that, something very much like it. And that's a question that's obviously so vague and ambiguous that it really only warrants one answer, and it's that answer that, as poker teachers, coaches, experienced poker players or mentors, we so loathe to give, and it's that one answer that poker students or just novice poker players looking for some advice so despise hearing. And the answer, of course, is it depends. So instead of rolling my eyes at this question, because I'm thinking there's probably a lot of people out there who really are kind of dying to get some kind of an answer to this question, right? Like, I mean, even if it's just a general answer to the question, or like, if it depends, what does it depend on? I mean, there's probably a lot of people out there looking for at least some basic guidelines to how to play ace-king pre-flop. So I'm going to go for it. Instead of rolling my eyes in disgust, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get in there and just kind of work on this. And I figure, it's a change of pace, and if nothing else, it's going to be fun. And, it might be at least a little bit enlightening to a chunk of people out there that are looking for some kind of answer to this, overly ambiguous question. And, what the heck, if you can have a little bit of fun and learn something about playing poker, that's got to be worth something, right? So, here we go. How should I play ace-king before the flop? Or how should I play ace-king pre-flop? And it probably depends, right? I mean, that's a given. That's a very ambiguous question, and a lot goes into it. So it probably depends. And if it depends, what does it depend on? And some of these things is what it depends on. It depends on number of players, position, previous action, stack depth, table image, your opponent's dispositions, bankroll. Are we talking just pre-flop? I mean, are we talking on live? Are we talking live? Are we talking cash game? Are we talking tournament? If it's a tournament, what's the format? What are the stakes that we're playing at, or the limits? Is this a limit game? Is it a no-limit game? Is it pot limit? History, reads, and I mean, I'm sure I missed a bunch of things, but just so on and so forth. And this is why this is such a difficult question to answer, is because it's not enough of a question. And the answer really seems to be, it depends. I mean, at a glance, that's the answer, that it depends. But on further examination, the way that I see it is, it really doesn't depend nearly as much as you might think it depends just at a glance. I mean, I think we're so used to thinking in these terms that if somebody asks us the question, hey, how do I play ace-king pre-flop? You're not even going to take the time to think if there's a rational, reasonable, like, guiding principle, or if there's any kind of even mildly satisfactory answer that you can give. You're just going to assume that there isn't one. But really, I think you can come to answering this question, you can come a lot closer to answering the question than I initially would have thought, even with just a few caveats. I mean, you can really come pretty close to answering the question, how should I play ace-king pre-flop, with one word, given just a few caveats. And the word is aggression. How should I play ace king? I should play it aggressively. See, it turns out that ace king isn't as variable sensitive as most other, maybe all other hands. It really just isn't as variable sensitive as most hands are. In fact, in just about any situation where you find yourself in a spot pre-flop where you should have an aggressive range, ace king should be a part of that range. I mean, pretty much any situation where you're gonna have some hands that raise or 3-bet or 4-bet or get it in. I mean, ace king's gonna be a part of that range. There are gonna be some caveats, and we'll discuss those at the end. But I mean, even if you started so deep that the only hand that you're strictly value jamming is pocket aces, like maybe, pre-flop, maybe you're like, I don't know, 800 big blinds deep, so the only strict value jam that you're going to have pre-flop is going to be pocket aces, you still may well find yourself wanting to have some non-ace hands in that shoving range, and ace king, because of the fact that it has the two best blockers you can have, and also I guess will do okay if your opponent gets real sticky at 800 big blinds with a hand like queens or worse, or it even has some equity against kings if you get it in against kings, and you're going to want to give your opponent incentive to call you with kings when you have aces that deep. So even if you're starting out that deep, I think that ace king could find its way into your raise, re-raise, re-re-raise, re-re-raise, shove, or get it in range, right? So there are going to be situations where this isn't the case, and like I said, we'll talk about those. I mean, but really, I think we can almost always jam or raise or re-raise or open raise ace king. I mean, generally speaking, poker ranges are extremely dynamic, and if you change any one of like several factors or a myriad of factors describing a given decision point, you change the best way to construct your ranges for that spot. And it would seem then at first thought that ace king, along with every other hand, should be played differently in different situations. That seems right at first thought. On further reflection, on further examination though, I've come to believe that the question, how should I play ace king preflop, really isn't that hard to answer. I think maybe if somebody asks you the question, how do I play ace king preflop, you should answer it, and you should just tell them aggressively. And you also need to kind of think about who would ask a question like that. And players that are likely to ask a question as vague as that are probably players that would be best off playing it exactly aggressively, exactly 100% of the time, and going to the felt with it pre-flop 100% of the times when they have the opportunity to get all in with it pre-flop. I mean, is it really that simple? Should we just always get aggressive with ace king? Under most circumstances, I would say it really is that simple. And it's because there's some special things about this hand. I tried to think of any other hand that might kind of come close to it, and there's not one. Like, pocket queens doesn't play this way. Pocket aces is close. Like, you could always make a case for jamming aces, but sometimes you can make a pretty good case for flatting aces. So aces and ace king are the only hands that I can feel pretty confident saying to a beginning player or sort of a novice, sort of inexperienced player, look, if you have this hand, just raise, re-raise, and get it in all the time. It's just ace king and aces. Like, there's definitely spots where you should be flat calling queens or even folding queens pre-flop. And we're going to talk about in this video why ace king works this way. So first of all, hands that play best heads up and don't like multi-way action have a lot of incentive to play aggressively before the flop, and ace king certainly falls into that category. The incentives that would generally cause us to aggress with a hand, they all seem to apply to ace king. The ability to get called by worse, the ability to get called by hands that you dominate, hands that if your hand is strong enough that you can play pretty effectively even if you get re-raised, then that is an incentive for aggression. hands that are going to play well versus your opponent's continuing ranges, hands that play best with a lower stack to pot ratio, hands that don't mind folding out their opponent's equity, because remember, even pocket twos has 50% or a bit more than 50% equity against ace king. So there's just tons and tons of reason to aggress with ace king, because basically all of the reasons that one would choose to aggress apply to ace king. And it even runs a little bit deeper than that when we consider the way ace king plays against like mediocre hands. Like ace king really doesn't play that well against wide ranges. If you're out of position 100 big blinds deep against a pretty good player who open raises on the button, 3-betting ace king from the small blind or big blind, it's got to be absolutely mandatory, because you don't want to take ace king offsuit, for instance, or even ace king suited, to the flop out of position against a hand like queen jack suited, jack 10 suited, pocket eights. I mean, you'd much prefer to 3-bet and clear out those hands that play best against it, and still dominate a lot of the hands that are going to call that raise. That's the thing. Like ace king actually plays better against the hands that will continue against aggression very often than it plays against hands that will either limp in, and like live cash games, or well, whatever the case. If your opponent has an open limping range, there's a pretty good chance that your ace king is going to play better against the hands that will call a raise than just limp and fold. So we don't mind folding out those hands, like queen 7 suited. Ace king is not a huge favorite against queen 7 suited, so we really don't mind just getting rid of all those janky hands that have pretty decent equity against ace king. Ace king plays fine in a single raised pot. Ace king plays fantastic in a 3-bet pot. And ace king doesn't mind at all and plays pretty well if we can just get all in pre-flop and see all 5 cards, right? And it often doesn't induce that well. Like if you can kind of slow play some big hands in a given spot to create aggressive and overly aggressive actions from your opponent, and I'm thinking of heads up mostly here, but this comes up in full ring even some of the time. But I'm thinking like if you're 20 big blinds deep or in a heads up sit and go, ace king induces okay, but it doesn't induce as well as hands like pocket queens, pocket jacks, pocket kings, pocket aces. Those hands induce a lot better, because a lot of the hands you might induce to jam against your ace king you might not be that big of a favorite against. Like if you induce pocket twos to jam on you 20 bigs deep, that's not great, right? So it often doesn't induce all that well, and it can almost always benefit from fold equity, and a lot of times it will benefit from fold equity, except for against the hands that you don't want to fold anyway, the hands that you dominate. Ace king doesn't mind getting it in pre-flop in most situations. It has good domination potential, and you're not really playing ace king for its nut potential or for its synergy or connectivity, not as much as you're playing it for its domination, showdown value, frequent strength. It's going to flop a lot of top pairs. When it does, it's going to flop top pair, top kicker, and it's not really going to make all that many monsters all that often. All of those things are great arguments in favor of being aggressive. So what should we do with ace king? We should raise, re-raise, get it in most of the time. Now this is especially true heads up, which is my forte. It's especially true online. And heads up online, it's obviously a slam dunk raise, 3-bet, 4-bet, whatever. You're always going to be aggressing with this hand pre-flop in a heads up spot. I think it's real close to I think it's almost accurate to say that you can just get blindly aggressive with ace king pre-flop online. I mean, if you're playing at the micro stakes, you've got a hell of a value raise or a value 3-bet, where players are just like calling way too wide against 3-bets, and they're going too far with second best hands post flop. If you're playing, at the highest stakes, the nosebleeds, then you don't mind just 3-betting ace king and clearing out your opponent's equity, taking down the dead money or creating some extra dead money to win with a c-bet post flop, and it barrels well too. So especially, I'll just go out on a little bit of a limb here and say, if you're playing micro stakes all the way to the nosebleeds at 6 max, you can always play ace king aggressively. I mean, if you're playing 6 max online and you're playing at the higher stakes, if you get it in any situation other than maybe like under the gun versus under the gun +1 against a nitty player, and you're beat, then you're kind of just beat. Because, you know, even in a situation that you get to this point where you're like, man, I think my ace king's not that great. Well, you know, yeah, sure, but that means that, like, you've opened, your opponent's 3-bet, you 4-bet, and then he jammed on you, and now you've obviously got a call. You're getting the right pot odds against their range, and at that point, you might think, well, you know, it kind of sucks that I got crazy aggressive with this hand, but you can't forget all the times that you get your opponent to fold a hand like pocket nines, or even just fold some like random queen 6 suited light 3-bet type hand. You can't forget about the times where your open raise takes the blinds down, or your 4-bet in response to a 3-bet folds your opponent's pocket pair out, or live cards out. You can't forget about the times you're creating dead money, or building a pot and just taking it down with a C-bet, just because in this one particular hand, you raise, your opponent 3-bets, you 4-bet, they ship, and you're like, well, shit, I guess I have to stack it now. Shouldn't have got so aggressive with ace-king. He turns over queens, you're in a flip, you lose the flip, and you know, maybe start telling yourself, maybe I should tone down the aggression with ace-king, and I say, nay, do not tone down the aggression with ace-king. That's a mistake. It plays better against hands like ace-queen, king-queen, king-jack, ace-jack, ace-10, king-10, than it plays against queen-jack, 9-8 suited, pocket 3s, jack-10. It plays better in a small stack-to-pot ratio. It plays better with fewer players. It doesn't mind folding out live cards. It loves to fold out pocket pairs. It has decent to great equity against every single hand your opponent could possibly have, except for pocket aces and pocket kings, and it's not even dead against kings, and it has blockers to the only 2 hands that crushes it, or has it in pretty bad shape. It doesn't mind seeing flops. It plays pretty well post-flop. It doesn't mind getting it in pre-flop. It's just kind of a good all-around hand to get super aggro with. So to me, the best question to ask about ace-king pre-flop is, when should we not get aggressive with ace-king pre-flop? And there are times, I guess, but these are the exception to the rule. So I think you can just kind of come out with a rule and say, this is the rule about ace-king. Aggress. Play very aggressively with ace-king. Be happy to take it to the felt pre-flop if you get the opportunity to. Stack it, right? Ace-king should likely be part of almost any aggressive range we have, but there will be spots where we won't want to have aggressive ranges. Like if you're super deep and you're out of position against a good player who like opens from the button and you're in the small blind or the big blind especially, I mean, maybe you wouldn't even want to have a 3-betting range in that case, because, well, for reasons I guess we don't need to get into too much here, but basically because your 2 options if you're going to create a 3-bet, I'll just get into this real quick. If you're super deep against a player who's in position and you're out of position, if he opens from like the button and you're in the big blind, say the small blind folds, maybe you don't want to have a 3-betting range, because 3-betting, your 3-bet range is going to have to be constructed in one of 2 ways. You're either going to have to polarize your 3-betting range, or you're going to have a depolarized 3-betting range. And if you polarize your 3-betting range and you're super deep, then you're going to have a lot of bluffs and you're going to get called often. So that's not good. When you're super deep, you've bloated a pot, but not enough to reduce the SPR enough to actually diminish your opponent's positional advantage, but you have bloated the pot. And with a polarized range, you're going to have too many bluffs when you're getting called too often against a player who's got position when you're deep stacked, and that's not good. And the only other thing you could do is have a value merged linear 3-betting range, and if you do that, then you're going to cap your flat calling range, and when your opponent's super deep, he's going to be able to put a lot of pressure on a capped range. Like every time you flat call, if you're using a linear value merged or depolarized 3-betting range and you flat call from the big blind super deep, then your opponent's going to be able to, he's going to know that when you call, you don't have that strong of a hand, and he's going to be able to put a lot of pressure on you because you're not going to have the right amount of strength in your range. Your range is going to be capped. You're not going to have like complete board coverage, and even when you 3-bet, if you're 3-betting a linear range super deep, out of position against a good player, then when you 3-bet, it's going to kind of turn your hand face up a little bit, and your opponent's going to know that if he puts pressure on you, most of your range is going to be like, well, it's going to be face up. Your opponent's going to be able to make very good decisions against you in position in a bloated pot that's not so bloated that it diminishes his skill edge. So if you're in a special case like that where maybe you shouldn't even have an aggression range, then of course you're not going to just 3-bet ace-king. But if you decide that you're going to 3-bet some hands in that spot, maybe you're going to try some kind of like super big bet 3-betting range that's going to be mostly polarized but with a few hands in the middle for board coverage or something like that, like really complicated and specialized. If you do open that 3-betting range in that situation, the first hand that goes in it, in my opinion, is ace-king, even over aces. Because one of the problems in that spot, remember, is that we don't want to have a capped flatting range. So maybe, you know, we have a mixed strategy with aces if we're going to be 3-betting some of the time when we are out of position super deep. We might want to have pocket aces at least a non-0% of the time when we flat call pre-flop in that spot. So ace-king is going to be the first hand I'm going to put into a 3-bet range if I decide that I'm going to have a 3-bet range. Now, if we're going to raise, re-raise, get it in under all but special cases, then it makes perfect sense to ask and to answer the question, how should I play ace-king pre-flop? Now, what are the variables? And how do they affect things? The variables that normally affect ranges and make this such an impossible question to answer. Format, like what format are you playing? Are you playing like a tournament? Are you playing limit? Are you playing no limit? Doesn't matter. Get aggressive with ace-king. Well, what about the payout structure? Doesn't matter. Get aggressive with ace-king. Well, what if you're out of position? What if you're in position? Doesn't matter. Previous action. What if everybody's limped? Doesn't matter. What if everybody's raised and re-raised? Doesn't matter. What if your opponent, does, I don't know, plays very fit or fold post-flop? Then raise with ace-king. What if he can't fold? If he plays very, very loose and gives too much action? Doesn't matter. Raise. What if we're real deep? Doesn't matter. Raise. None of this matters. We're just always getting aggressive with ace-king. Except for the caveats that we've mentioned or that we will mention. So with ace-king and getting aggressive with it pre-flop, it plays great as a short stack shove. It flops well in single raised and 3-bet pots. It c-bets well. It barrels well. It has robust equity in that you're either going to have showdown value with ace high on a lot of boards and a lot of runouts, or you're just always going to have either top pair, top kicker, or 2 overcards. So it's got showdown value and equity that has a tendency to hold up over multiple streets, but at the same time it doesn't mind getting all in and just seeing all 5 cards pre-flop to avoid making any kind of mistakes beyond pre-flop. It bluff catches nicely on a lot of board textures. It's almost never that far behind pre-flop, right? I mean, it's behind pocket pairs, but not by much. And it blocks aces, it blocks kings. I mean, some people, well, myself included, I guess, often when we're constructing a 3-bet range and we're putting, if we're polarizing a 3-bet range, say from the button versus a late position steal, like if we're creating or constructing a re-steal range from the button, one of the main things we want to have in the hands that we're going to make our light 3-bets with is a blocker to aces or a blocker to kings. This has a blocker to aces and a blocker to kings. It's useful to have in your aggressive ranges. Like, just the threat of having ace-king in your range when you open raise your 3-bet pre-flop allows you to take down a ton of pots post-flop because there's an ace on the flop. It slices, dices, purees, stacks busters, creates dead money, grabs said money, always has the odds to stack off, and so on and so forth. Now, in case you're not convinced yet, I want to use a couple of examples that are vastly different, because I think that, in making these videos that I make and creating all this strategy content, one of the things I figured out is I've found some kind of like shortcuts to learning, or some very efficient ways to teach and learn. And one of those is, if you can show two situations that are worlds apart, then using those two very opposite scenarios can teach you an awful lot. Because if you know that you should do this, whatever it is, exercise option A or make play A, when this situation is, I don't know, like heads up with 8 big blinds, and you shouldn't do this when you're at a full ring game under the gun with 200 bigs effective against every player at the table, then you can learn a lot about that situation by asking yourself why. And then finding like some middle point, saying, okay, well, if we never do it here, we always do it there. And if we're in the center, then we do it some of the time. Then you can be pretty confident that you're onto something. And another way we can build intuition pretty easily or quickly or efficiently is by looking at two situations that are very far apart and finding what things they have in common. And one of the things that I stumbled on when I was thinking about this video and making it is that you can do that with Ace King simply by asking the question, what would I do with this hand with 8 big blinds in a heads up situation, heads up sit and go, against my opponent if my opponent's a complete fish? What should I do with Ace King there? And let's take a very opposite scenario where we're like 200, 300, 400 big blinds deep against a table full of murderers, and they're all just as deep as we are. We, like, say we have the effective stack with 400 big blinds. What are we doing with Ace King in its raise or re-raise from literally any position? So what does that tell you? Well, it tells me that if we know that it's a good idea to get aggressive with Ace King in the situation where we're 8 big blinds effective against one player who's a total fish, and I think it's safe to say we know that, and if we also know that we should be aggressive with Ace King very deep in a full ring live cash game against the best players on the planet, and I think it's also safe to say that we know that we should be getting aggressive with Ace King in that situation, well, what else do we have to know? What else do we have to talk about or discuss, really? If we know that we should be aggressive in both of those spots with Ace King, then that's almost drop the mic, walk off the stage, slam the book shut. You know the answer. What do you do with Ace King? You get aggro with it. So just looking at these examples, deep stack, 75 big blinds, heads up, sit and go versus a tight, kind of nitty, break-even tag type player. Tag is a relative term, but like a tighter player in heads up, sit and go world. What do you do with Ace King? You're going to 3-bet it and 4-bet it and 5-bet it and just get it in pre-flop if you can. What about 400 big blinds deep in a full ring cash game? What if you 3-bet one of these villains above and get 4-bet? What should you do? What if a nit opens from under the gun? A 6-player sit and go, 100 big blinds effective. I mean, I didn't tailor make these situations. I was just typing situations in almost at random as they popped into my head. And the answer is always to get aggressive. So you really have to look for spots, specifically try to think about what types of spots you might not want to get aggressive with Ace King. And it's not that easy to even think of them. But if you know that you're playing against a bunch of nits, or even a bunch of weak passive players that don't raise very often, if they don't open light, if they don't 3-bet light, and they don't like do any kind of like thin value raising, or if they're just not raising very often for whatever reason, either they're really tight nitty or they're weak passive, and you see it go like raise, 3-bet, all in, call in front of you, you can probably go ahead and muck your Ace King. It's not trivial though. I mean, it really is not trivial. You could still be up against like pocket jacks, pocket queens, and have the only ace king, and that's a really good situation. Because if you have ace king against say 2 other players and get all in against 2 out of the 5 players that started going crazy and create some dead money to boot, ace king is the best. I mean, it's the best hand between, like, how would I put this? Ace king it's gonna win way more than its fair share if it gets all in against 2 players that both have pocket pairs, because all you have to do is just hit your pocket, your ace or your king, and most likely you beat both of your opponents. Pocket jacks in that scenario, if, like, let's say it goes like raise, 3-bet, all in, call, it comes to you, and you know that these players are pretty tight players, you could probably fold ace king. But if you do, and you see the 2 initial, like the open raiser and the 3-bet are both fold, and then the other 2 players table pocket jacks and pocket queens, you did yourself a pretty significant disservice there. Because you're still not going to win the hand if you had called quite 50% of the time, but it's got to be close. Like it might be, like, without crunching the numbers just off the top of my head, you might be winning that, getting a huge price, like way more than break even, and you still might be like, okay, so you're getting 2 players all in, plus the dead money, plus whatever was in the blinds, and if there's antes, those are in there too. So there's a bunch of dead money in there, and if you're against exactly queens and jacks, you are damn near, I bet you've got 40% equity, something like that. Because if you hit your ace or your king, you're probably going to beat both of those players. Pocket queens is in a pretty reasonable spot, and pocket jacks is just screwed. But I think you're in the best situation there. You've got the best bang for the buck there. And I kind of already talked about this. If you've got a pretty tight player who raises under the gun and you're also in early position, you might not want to 3-bet in that situation. But that might also be covered in situations where you don't want to have a 3-betting range. A lot of good players just don't 3-bet versus under the gun when they themselves are in early position because of kind of this exact problem. When we don't want to cap our flatting range, when we don't want to have a face-up re-raising range, or if we don't even want to have a re-raising range, then obviously we're not just going to raise with ace-king. And you could just say in general here too, if you're in a spot where your opponent's just not going to make very many mistakes against you when you have ace-king, like maybe he opens from early position, you 3-bet from middle position, he 4-bets you, then maybe you don't want to take it to the felt. Maybe you want to call, under rep your hand, expect him to c-bet the boards that you hit and barrel your turn cards, that kind of thing. But if you have, I would say if you have enough poker wisdom and enough poker chops to know when you should not raise or re-raise with ace-king pre-flop, then you should not be asking the question, how do I play ace-king before the flop, right? In summary, how do we play X hand is usually a crap question, and the answer is almost always that it depends. But ace-king plays better versus stronger hands than it plays against weaker hands. That's where a lot of this weirdness comes from. Remember, it's got much more equity against king-queen than it does against 9-8 suited. It's got a lot more equity against ace-queen than it does pocket 2s, right? So it just plays better versus the stronger hands than it does the weaker ones. And I don't just mean that it's a bigger favorite, but it also specifically plays better against ace-queen than it does 9-8 suited. Like, if you go to the flop against 9-8 suited, you're not in a real super dominant situation there. And if you're out of position against a strong player, and especially if you're very deep, I don't even know if you're in a good situation. But conversely, if you're in that same situation but your opponent has ace-queen, you're in a very good situation. And oftentimes you can create that situation by virtue of a phenomenon called range manipulation, where if a player opens in late position and you flat call, you keep their entire range intact. So you go to the flop against every hand that they had in their open raising range. But if you 3-bet pre-flop, you only get to the flop against those hands that continue against your 3-bet. And so by virtue of range manipulation, very often you're going to be able to 3-bet ace-king and take it heads up against the hands that you would prefer to play against it. Like if you take ace-king offsuit up against 9-8 suited, 300 big blinds deep, and you're out of position, I think you're going to have a pretty good skill edge to make money in that spot. I mean, I would much rather be the guy that has 9-8 suited on the button than ace-king from the big blind if we're 200 big blinds deep, for sure. But if I have ace-queen compared to ace-king, then it's not the case. So, yeah, this ace-king plays better against pretty strong hands than it does against, not that good of hands. It also plays better with a lower stack to pot ratio, so you don't have to worry so much about reverse implied odds, or like flopping top pair, top kicker against a set and just getting murdered. It doesn't mind getting all in pre-flop. It doesn't hate folding out its opponent's equity, and it's really hard for your opponent to play perfectly against ace-king. And because it's going to be really, really hard for your opponent to fold hands like ace-queen and ace-jack suited and king-queen, but call with hands like pocket nines and pocket eights. It wouldn't really make sense for a player to do that. So even if he's playing pretty well, then you've got a pretty obvious spot to get aggressive. And if he's playing badly, he's got to be playing badly in one of two ways, right? Pre-flop, he's either got to be responding to your 3-bets by continuing too often or not often enough. And both of those situations are likely to be okay with you, because ace-king is going to be in pretty good shape against almost every hand, and it blocks the hands that it's in bad shape against. It may be the very best hand for aggression in most situations. It may be, I don't mean that it's going to be the most profitable. That will almost always be aces. But what I mean is it may be the clearest raising hand for the most situations. I mean, there are always cases and arguments that can be made for slow playing, or having an uncapped flatting range, or maybe doing some limp raise kind of stuff in a live 2-5 game. I've been toying around with that as a concept. I don't think it's a bad idea. And if you're going to have a limping range from under the gun at a 2-5 cash game at your local casino, if I haven't been clear enough for you, let me just say, if you want to have you should have some very strong hands in your limping range. If you're going to have an open limping range in early position, hands like aces, hands like kings would be probably a decent idea as a splash. If you're going to want to have some hands that limp, then you're going to want to have some hands that limp and call, some hands that limp and fold, and some hands that limp and raise. Otherwise, if you don't have a limp, if you have an open limping range, but you don't have limp calls, limp raises, and limp folds, then you're going to be too easy to play against, too exploitable. But in case you haven't figured out from this entire video yet, the number one hand that I think you should not be limping in with, you do not want to include this in your open limping range. This is actually a pretty good example for this concept. If you are going to open an under-the-gun open limping range at your local $1, $2 no-limit hold'em cash game at the casino, the hand you do not want to put in there is ace-king. Don't do it. Because if you open limp with ace-king and you cause a chain limp, if you kind of are igniting the first spark that causes you to go 6 players to the flop with tons of money behind, and with all these opponents, even if you flop top pair, top kicker, it's not going to be an easy situation to play. I mean, you're out of position. Top pair, top kicker is tricky when you're deep with a big high SPR, which you've helped to create by limping in, and it's difficult to play against a ton of players. So open limping can really be disastrous if you're going to use ace king. If you open raise, you're just going to do a lot better to do that. Even if you're going to have this open limping range in these spots, use hands that induce better, and use hands that play better if it happens to go all the way through to the big blind without being raised. Use hands that, like can flop top set and overset somebody, like kings and aces, and that aren't quite as vulnerable as ace king and easier to play. It's usually not strong enough of a hand to trap with. That's the thing. That's the thing. It's not quite strong enough to trap with. Just everything about it says raise with me. Unlike queen, it blocks the hands that crush it, and that's a big thing. There are plenty of spots where flat calling queens can be the correct strategy, but continuing to aggress with ace king is the correct strategy, and that's not because queens are a better hand. It's just because of range manipulation. It's because of the way that hands and ranges are going to continue against your aggression. It's really everything I've said in this video. I guess I feel like I'm kind of beating a dead horse at this point. Unlike queen, it blocks the hands that crush it. Unlike ace, bad hands are drawing live against it. Unlike ace 10, it is rarely dominated. So yeah, I guess that's it. That's my thing. Now you know. If you didn't know how to play ace king, now you know. Until next time, guys. Navanad. Good, quote, Luck, end quote, and ship it, monkey.